Diabetes is far more reversible than most people think. You do not have to survive on salads. It is okay to eat meat. Diabetes itself is usually not the scary part. The complications are. That is what almost nobody explains clearly. A lot of people hear the word diabetes and immediately imagine dialysis, blindness, amputations, kidney failure, things like that. But diabetes itself is usually not what damages the body the most. The real danger is the slow damage happening underneath the surface for years before people realize how serious it has become. And once somebody understands how diabetes actually develops, the whole thing starts making much more sense. Most people hear the phrase insulin resistance constantly, but then the explanation usually stops there. And that is where people get confused, because people hear diabetes is caused by high blood sugar. Then they also hear diabetes is connected to obesity, especially belly fat. At first, that sounds strange, because fat and sugar do not sound related at all, but inside the body, they become very closely connected. Glucose is fuel. After carbohydrates are digested, glucose enters the bloodstream so cells can use it for energy. But glucose floating around in the blood does not really help the body very much by itself. It has to enter cells first, especially muscle cells. That part matters more than many adults realize because muscle is one of the biggest places glucose gets used after meals. And muscles are working constantly all day long, whether people notice it or not. Walking around the house, climbing stairs, carrying groceries, standing up from a chair. Even ordinary movement throughout the day keeps muscles continuously using fuel. Normally, the body handles this process very well. You eat, blood sugar rises, insulin gets released, and cells respond the way they are supposed to. Glucose enters the cell, and the system works normally. But glucose cannot simply move into cells by itself. The body needs insulin to help deliver the signal. One of the easiest ways to picture it is almost like somebody ringing a doorbell. Insulin basically shows up and says, "Glucose is here. Open the door." And under healthy conditions, cells respond normally. The problem starts when fat slowly begins accumulating inside muscle cells and liver cells over time, especially with excess abdominal weight, because once that happens, the insulin signal gradually becomes harder for the body to process efficiently, almost like somebody trying to hear a doorbell inside a noisy house. The signal is still there, but the response becomes weaker. And that is really what insulin resistance is. The body is still trying very hard. The problem is that the system is no longer responding normally anymore. At first, the pancreas compensates surprisingly well. Blood sugar starts staying elevated longer than it should, so the pancreas simply releases more insulin, trying harder to force the message through. And for a while, that actually works. That is one reason many adults have insulin resistance quietly developing for years before diabetes ever officially appears on blood tests. The body was already struggling underneath the surface. It was simply compensating strongly enough to keep blood sugar from rising dramatically yet. Eventually, though, the whole system starts getting overwhelmed. Cells become less responsive, the pancreas keeps pushing out more insulin, and blood sugar starts staying elevated longer after meals. That is usually when diabetes finally becomes visible. But the process itself often started much earlier. That is also why muscle matters so much after 60, because muscle acts almost like a storage space for glucose. Healthy muscle constantly helps remove sugar from the bloodstream and use it normally. That is one reason physically active people often handle carbohydrates much better metabolically. But after 60, many adults gradually lose muscle mass over time, especially when activity levels slowly decrease. And once muscle starts shrinking, the body suddenly has fewer places to send glucose after meals. So blood sugar rises more easily. Insulin rises more easily too, and insulin resistance gradually worsens underneath the surface. That is one reason abdominal weight gain and diabetes become so closely connected later in life. The body just stops handling fuel normally anymore. People often notice their energy dropping more after meals, weight becoming harder to control, recovery feeling slower than it used to. A lot of people assume that is simply aging. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes the body has been struggling with insulin resistance quietly for years. And this is actually the part many people do not realize. When abdominal weight starts coming down, insulin sensitivity often improves surprisingly fast. Cells begin responding more normally again, blood sugar improves, and sometimes the improvement happens much faster than people expected. That surprises many adults because people often think diabetes automatically means permanent, irreversible damage forever. Not necessarily, especially early. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand diabetes completely, because many adults think the dangerous part is simply having high blood sugar. Not exactly. The complications are what become dangerous over time. The blood vessel damage, the nerve damage, the kidney problems, the vision complications that slowly develop underneath the surface, those are the things doctors worry about long term. And honestly, this is why diabetes itself often feels confusing to people. Because early on, most adults do not feel dramatically sick. They are still working, driving, traveling, spending time with family, living normally. Meanwhile, the damage may already be slowly building underneath the surface. That is also why diabetes can quietly progress for years before somebody realizes how serious it has become. And this is where muscle matters much more than people realize. Because muscle is one of the biggest places glucose is supposed to go after meals. Healthy muscle constantly pulls glucose out of the bloodstream and uses it normally. The more active muscle stays, the easier it becomes for the body to handle fuel efficiently. That is one reason walking after meals helps blood sugar so much. People think walking simply burns calories. It does, but it also gives glucose somewhere to go. The body handles sugar much better when muscle is actively working. But after 60, many adults gradually lose muscle mass over time, especially when activity levels slowly decrease. And once muscle starts shrinking, the body suddenly has fewer places to send glucose after meals. Blood sugar rises more easily, insulin stays elevated longer, and over enough years, the body just starts struggling to keep up anymore. That is one reason abdominal weight becomes so connected to diabetes later in life. And usually, this does not happen overnight. It builds slowly. That part is important because many adults assume diabetes appears suddenly. Most of the time, the process has already been developing quietly underneath the surface for years. And this is also why early treatment matters so much. Because once people understand what the body is struggling with, diabetes management becomes much less frightening. The goal is not starving people forever. The goal is reducing the overload the body has been dealing with constantly. Less constant blood sugar spikes, less constant insulin demand, more movement, better muscle activity, better sleep, weight reduction when needed. That is what improves insulin resistance. And this is actually the part many people never hear clearly enough. Diabetes often improves much faster than people expect when abdominal weight starts coming down and activity levels improve again. Sometimes blood sugar improves within months, sometimes faster than people expected. That surprises many adults because people often assume diabetes automatically means permanent, irreversible damage forever. Not necessarily, especially early. And this is also why doctors focus heavily on weight reduction early after diagnosis. Because once excess fat inside muscle and liver cells starts decreasing, insulin signaling often begins working more normally again. The body responds better. Glucose gets handled more efficiently. The whole system becomes easier to control again. And this is where people sometimes misunderstand diabetes medication too. A lot of adults think, if I need medication, that means I failed. Not really. The goal is preventing complications. That is the important part. Because blood vessels do not really care whether glucose stayed controlled through exercise, weight loss, medication, or some combination of everything together. What matters is reducing long-term damage underneath the surface. And honestly, many adults live very normal lives with diabetes when it stays controlled early and consistently. That becomes extremely important to understand because fear causes many people to react in strange ways. Some panic unnecessarily. Others ignore the disease completely because they still feel fine. Neither helps very much. What actually helps is understanding what the body is struggling with in the first place. The body is still trying very hard to regulate blood sugar. Insulin is still trying to work. Cells just stop responding normally anymore. And this is also one reason diabetes became dramatically more common over the last several decades. Human metabolism developed during periods where food scarcity was normal. Most populations historically were not eating constantly all day long with processed food available everywhere. But modern life changed very quickly. Frequent eating, sugary drinks, late-night snacking, less movement, more abdominal weight, and over enough time the body just starts struggling to keep up anymore. That is why diabetes rates rose so dramatically, especially in populations that historically stayed leaner for generations. And honestly, this is one reason many adults improve dramatically once they finally become more active again. Walking more consistently, maintaining muscle, losing abdominal weight gradually, sleeping better, eating with more balance instead of overwhelming the system constantly throughout the day. Not because the body suddenly became young again, because the body finally stopped getting overloaded every single day. And once people understand that, diabetes starts making much more sense. It stops feeling mysterious. It stops feeling random. And it becomes easier to understand why movement, weight control, muscle maintenance, blood sugar control, and early treatment matter so much long-term. Because the dangerous part is not the diagnosis itself. The dangerous part is allowing uncontrolled damage to continue quietly underneath the surface for years. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next.